Mr Speaker.
I call Simon O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, I'm delighted to be taking a call on this bill, now known as the Compensation for Live Organ Donors Bill, and because we do have, I believe, with a bit of prescience, support across the House, soon to be an Act of Parliament after royal assent. Can I begin by acknowledging the member who has sponsored this bill, Chris Bishop, who has done a tremendous job shepherding it through the House. As many members have noted in any of these members' days, it's a very rare chance that the biscuit tin is in your favour. And when it is, in fact, I think, how many bills have you had out now? Is it two? Two, right. So this man is incredibly lucky. But to actually shepherd it all the way through is quite unique, And so here we are at the third reading. In acknowledging Chris, I do want to acknowledge the other MPs that have been involved in the past. We've heard Dr Cam Calder's name mentioned, and before that, the initiator of this particular bill with the Honourable Michael Woodhouse. But I do also want to mention, not directly with this bill, but Jackie Blue, who in her time spent quite a bit of effort. And in that space, and it's sort of a linkage of names to Andy Tukey, I had the pleasure of actually meeting Andy many, many years ago. He won't remember, but it was through Jackie Blue, as he was, I think, as the previous speaker was indicating, a very passionate advocate, and was speaking with Jackie. So a number of people have been involved, but I think really importantly it has been Chris who has brought it to the House and shepherded it through. And in that regard too, very grateful to the work of the Select Committee. It's a marvellous committee to chair, even during annual reviews sometime, but actually the committees work quite cooperatively, first and foremost with the member, but also cooperatively within to try and improve the bill even further. It came in good shape, and in terms of those discussions had within the committee, we were able to make some improvements. And look, one of them was something as simple, and Chris was very keen on this, around the title change. Initially, this was around financial compensation, financial assistance, and we then moved it to compensation. And anyone who has followed any of the speeches in the House know I'm a great believer in words and the importance of words, and it was quite critical that we signal that this bill is based around an altruism of those who are donating. Again, we are talking about live transplants here, live donations, and it is our compensation. In fact, you could almost go as far to say it's still only a partial compensation, even though I'll get to the whole point of 100% remuneration around income, but actually there's a lot greater altruism going on here, and this bill is an attempt to compensate some of that, rather than sort of being some generous action alone of the state to financially assist someone. So the committee moved that change, but the committee too has been very conscious that we do have, as speakers have mentioned, and I'm sure we're going to hear from the remaining speakers, we have very low donation rates. I think it's about 300 over the last 3 or so years. Very low, primarily for kidneys, but there are other organs which can be live donated, partial lungs, livers, pancreas, and importantly, it was something I was quite keen on and really pleased that Chris Bishop was open to it as well, was making sure that there's a provision in this bill to add in further organs. Now, of course, those clinically minded know there is a limit to just how much can be introduced in before we move from live to, well, not live, but there's an opportunity, if developments are such, that via order in council, extra organs can be added into this bill. In other words, we don't have to go through the rigmarole, if you will, of the House process of introducing a further piece of legislation. As we said, though, low donation rates, but we also know there's I think it's about 1,100 people, 1,100 people who are actually on Ministry of Social Development benefits related to kidney failures or having health issues related to kidneys or organs. And what this represents is actually an opportunity, and again, I'd better be clear before articulating this further, not trying to put out purely a utilitarian argument, but actually there are people out there in New Zealand who will obviously benefit from a donation, but from a purely governmental, let's say, accounting standpoint, the fact that there are people on the benefit currently who could actually benefit from live organ donation is not only good for them in their health, but also good for the Crown's accounts. And so that's been, I suppose, one of the reasons, amongst others, that we as a committee decided to move the recompense of this bill from 80% to 100%. And again, I suppose there's lots of nuances in this debate, but again, we don't think that simply reimbursing a person 100% of their income represents the entire cost associated with the donation, but we saw it as a really important step. Importantly too, we decided not to go beyond 100%. There was some conversation of whether we should make this 120%, 150%. Do you go even as far as 200%? There came a tipping point, as it were, Mr. Speaker, between actively trying to support and encourage, but not to try and make it too much of an incentive, if we could articulate it that way. So we felt we've landed in the right space. Importantly too, this recognises people who are obviously earning an income in some shape or form, be it, as I say, a sole trader to be salaried, right through to people on benefits, including those on ACC. And I talked about this in the second reading, but we had a little bit of work to do around the ACC recompense, that we didn't want someone to lose their entitlement if they were already on ACC and donating an organ. And under the current structures and legislation, someone would, who is on ACC for whatever reason, who then chooses to give an organ, would have had to have been retested for their eligibility for ACC once they'd recovered. And so with a bit of creativity through the committee, and certainly with the advice of the officials, we decided what we would do instead is, if someone who's on ACC or getting ACC entitlements would not be actually taken off, but have their entitlement reduced to $0. In other words, it continues, but they're just not receiving that particular income. But the long and short message there is, regardless of how someone has an income or gains their income, this bill covers that. Chris Bishop also acknowledged we have moved the jurisdiction or the management for live organ donation from the Ministry of Social Development to the Ministry of Health. It was pretty clear feedback pretty early on that it was felt it was more appropriate, first and foremost, within the Ministry of Health. And secondly, there's some sort of confusion or misunderstanding, perhaps, within MSD, or people to even know to approach. And having worked within the Ministry of Social Development many years ago, I'd have to say that someone coming in to test their full and correct entitlement for organ donation doesn't happen all that often, and you could perceive lead to confusions. Jumping back also to the area of income, whatever someone's income is, that is what's going to be recompensed. There is no limit. There was lots of discussion in the committee on that. Should we actually be capping the total remuneration? And the answer there was no. Look, the other elements I just quickly want to touch on is not particularly in the live organ donation front, but the wider discussion around deceased organ donation. New Zealand certainly has a long way to catch up, and it was certainly my intention and that of the committees that we would have those discussions somewhat during this this bill's progression. I think it was important that naturally we talked about the live donorship, but we also tried to touch a little bit around deceased. And I've talked about it before, but I think the Israeli model has some real value, particularly around those who choose to donate, that they are put effectively at the top of the list themselves if they in turn require a donation. The other side, and it's not punitive, I think it's just actually realistic, that if someone chooses not to donate an organ, then they in turn are not to be a recipient in the first instance of one. I do too just want to pick up on something that Annette King was talking about at the end around, obviously, once someone has deceased and how the family relationships work. Primarily because while there's some great ideas out there of how we might manage this, and in some ways it sounds really easy that if someone who is deceased has had previous wishes articulated, they should be honoured, and I think there's real merit to that. It is a difficult area. Having spent a lot of time in hospitals, it's a very traumatic moment for families when a loved one dies, particularly if they are brain dead, which has been somewhat clinical as an ideal time for a donorship to happen. It is a very traumatic time for families, and having been beside them often when those conversations are being had, I suppose just wanting to acknowledge that, and that obviously this Parliament, I think it probably will be governmental, is It's an awkward conversation, but primarily one that has to be had, but it's not a simple issue. But I think, and I'm hoping that through this bill, further conversations will be had and more organ donations will happen. And thank you to those that are already engaging in the live organ side.